we have another interactive game, and Chloe will be sending out the link to everyone. It's our final interactive activity for the year tonight. So we're just going to do something really short and simple, hopefully get everybody to participate. So I'll just, the instructions are in the link. So simply get a workspace, and you can claim your workspace by right-clicking on one of the frames and renaming it with either your name or social media handle. If you're using a social media handle, we'll tag you after this event. And for today, what we'd like you to do is to copy paste some images of what best represents Singapore, or any copy, like what was your favorite thing about 2021 in Singapore. And there's a link here. You can just click into either Google Images or even from your own images, and preferably something that has a transparent background, but don't feel too limited by that. And just simply, like I copy pasted images. And also you can please click and hide your the circle once you claim your spot. And once you're done, you can click on this link to visit a virtual version of Singapore. So as people are trickling in, you can join the file. Oh, hold on a second, let me just get the link. Are people able to join?
Yes, I see already a lot of people on the board, actually.
Oh.
Yeah, just for some reasons it's not reflecting on the screen.
Yeah.
Okay, wait, let me share my screen.
Okay. All right, thanks, Shen.
Okay.
Yeah, I see everyone on the screen. Okay, I think I got it now.
Okay. So yeah, already a lot of people adding things in. I see a Merlion here, a cute Merlion, really nice. It looks like a chessboard right now. I don't know what's going to be like.
Oh, someone's using a mask to. Yeah, feel free to put some interactive components as well that just got out of beta. So that's pretty exciting.
Fireworks.
We have about 10 minutes for this activity, and it's just like really like easy, and hope everyone can go crazy.
Let me know when you want to go to the interactive bit.
Yeah, maybe when we have like 50%, like keep observing. Ooh, Yakun toast.
Okay, maybe I should go to the interactive bit already now.
Okay, let's go to the interactive game. You have it? Oh.
Loading.
Loading. Oh, no, I pressed R to restart. You accidentally clicked on it.
Oh,
Yeah, I should just wait for it to load because there are
Okay.
quite a lot of images.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So everyone can actually view this on like their own computers and it won't like affect the progress. Like,
Yeah.
no, yeah. Oh no, it's loading quite slowly. Okay.
Probably a lot of images.
Uh,
Oh, it's getting there. It's getting there.
Getting there. Okay, we'll just wait for everyone. Oh my God, it's getting faster and faster.
Yes,
It's
yes.
jumping.
It's getting more excited. Okay,
Share
I
my
think I
screen
can
again because
start
mine is
playing.
yeah, mine's
Oh yeah,
loaded.
okay. Let me
Yeah,
stop
share my
sharing. Let me
screen.
share.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. No, it's actually just I think it's Zoom.
Yeah,
Oh,
I
okay.
think it's Zoom.
Yeah. All right. So should we start playing?
Yes.
Go play.
Okay. All right. Oh my God. Oh my God. It's like moving so slowly. Okay, wait, hold on. Let me just say it again. It's like walking. You can play on your own computers, it'll be faster. You can double space to jump higher, and then it comes back to like running. And oh, there we go. Oh,
I love it. I love it.
This is so
11,
cool.
11.
oh no. Okay, I'm not gonna use spacebar because I think it's like tripping it up. Okay, I'm gonna just restart. Okay.
Oh, I see my durian.
Oh, okay. Why is it working like that? Sorry, let me just double check something. Should be fine. Okay. No. It's not moving now.
It's just Zoom. Damn Zoom.
Yeah. Can everyone play on your computers and see like if it's working? Like, it was working for me earlier.
It's also very lagging on mine, so I'm not sure.
Oh dear. Hmm.
It did well to work for me as well. But you know,
Yeah, it's adding to the charm. Like,
Okay, hold on, let me try to fix it.
well, it works.
It's still fun to see all the things people added in.
Yeah.
Oh, so good.
Okay, I do hope everyone had some little fun when adding these images in and seeing it on your own computer. Thanks everyone for taking part of that. And okay, before we move on to Steph's great talk, I do want to, yeah, bring people attention to the following. We're also going to have a competition today with tied to this talk. Now, Bill, do you want to briefly? Yeah.
yeah, sure. So after the talk, we will get some information about a design challenge, which will be posted on a channel on Design Buddies. And stay tuned because it's going to be really fun, and we'll get more details after Stephanie speaks.
Okay.
And just to introduce Design Buddies for those who don't know, it's an inclusive design community, and we just passed 30,000 members this week. So we'll post some links in the chat soon. and you can feel free to join.
Thanks, Nabil. And let's hand it over to Steph.
All right. Thank you so much, everyone. Oh my God, that author thing was so cute. It's so nice to see that. Let me just start sharing my screen. All right, so can everyone see my screen and also hear me now?
Yes, we can.
All right, okay. Okay, so let me do this. And yes, so hello everyone, I'm Stephanie, and I think I see some very familiar faces in the group, so some of you may know me. So right now I am a content strategist at Google Pay. And if you know you're looking at this screen, you'll see that before I was at Google Pay, I was at a few different startups in Southeast Asia, some very familiar names here. And you know, being part of all these different startups, I've had the opportunity to write for different locales, for different markets. So, you know, I've written a bit for Southeast Asia, I've written for places like Hong Kong and Taiwan, you know, some places I've written for India, written for the US, some Western markets as well. I think that's, for me at least, the interesting thing is just, you know, thinking about how for me at least, I have been writing in English for all these different markets, but there are obviously very different cultural nuances in each of these markets. All right, so yes, again, today I'll be talking about UX writing across different cultures. And there are two aspects to this. So one is translation. So again, you know, if you're going into a different market, some of these markets might have different languages. So that's one aspect. I know in this case, you're thinking a lot about how you might write in that language and also what are some UI changes you might make. The other aspect is, you know, how you might want to localize your English because, you know, different markets, you might want to adjust your tone, your style, just different things to fit that culture better. And of course, today I'm going to be talking about how you might do that for English. But these are, of course, all different things that you might also take into consideration if you're writing in a different language too. All right, so before I go into translations, I just wanted to give out a little shout out as well. This is an article written by Nina, who's a writer I worked with and who's also in this chat. A very great starting point if you're thinking about how to write for local markets. I can find it on Medium. And yeah, so, you know, if you're thinking about translations, you know, I think as a writer myself, it's hard enough writing copy. You know, I go for all these product meetings, I have enough context. And a lot of the time, you know, I'm iterating back and forth. I'm going for all these different reviews. I'm in conversations with engineers, with designers, working through all these different constraints. And there's so many different things to figure out. So I think, you know, imagining how difficult it is for me with all that background context, imagine how difficult it is for translators who don't necessarily have, you know, the same resources as you might have. So I think like one thing, at least for me, was just always thinking about how you can come to this from a place of empathy. And the other factor here, I think, so I wanted to show this example because, you know, this is top of mind for everyone right now. So, you know, most of you, I think, would be familiar with Squid Game. And the two things that, you know, stuck out to me here. One, I think, was there was a conversation, there was some feedback around the fact that, you know, some of the subtitles in the show weren't accurately translated. And because of that, some of the nuances were lost. So, you know, that was a very interesting conversation. I don't want to spoil it for you in case you haven't seen it. But, you know, listen, if you're familiar with the language and you're also familiar with English, it's a good contrast, to look out for. The other thing that stuck out to me was the fact that, they had these VIPs who were Americans in the show. And I think, there was also some conversation around the fact that the way they spoke was just very unnatural. And it was highly likely that the person who wrote the script for them, or the person who wrote that dialogue, might not have been a native English speaker. And it was interesting to me because, I'm so used to watching Western movies, for example, where you might hear someone speaking in a local language and you think, what, this just doesn't sound right, right? So this was an interesting experience seeing how that translated back the other way. So I think I just wanted to bring this up as well to set some context to some of the things we'll be looking at next. All right, so knowing these things, knowing some of the constraints we have, what are some things that, US writers as designers can do to help optimize these translations? I think one, of course, is, again, coming from that place of empathy. Think of resources that you can use, that you can equip your translators with. So for example, as writers, we want to make sure that our copy is consistent, that it's written in a tone and style that is appropriate for the market and the audience that we're writing for. So think about how you can do the same for your translators, whether it's sharing, style guides that you use, or whether it's co-authoring terminology lists, for example. So one example, again, so Malay is the one other language I speak. So one example here is, whether you would use the word amak or ibu, which are both words that mean the same thing. But, if you're using one word, you would want to be consistent throughout the text. So these are some things that you can co-author with your translators. The other thing that might be helpful is understanding that, sometimes your translators are looking at copy, looking at strings in isolation. So they might not be looking at it, on a screen, or they might be only seeing the header, but not the accompanying subheader, and don't always have that context. So I think wherever it's helpful, like, provide messaging notes, things like that, that can give them the context that you had while you're actually crafting this copy. Some of these notes are also useful, to help them figure out where things might not be directly translated, but could be transcreated instead. So what this means is that, the copy is not translated word for word, but your translator has some flexibility in the choice of words they use, because you've given them enough context to make those judgment calls. All right, so some other things that you can do to be helpful, avoid some of these, colloquial terms or slang words that might be difficult to translate in different markets. Of course, if you work very closely with a translator, you could give them enough guidance where they could substitute this with something that's more appropriate for market. But these also, I guess, some things that you can look out for and make the right language strategy choice, depending on how closely you work with a translator. And yeah, some things that you might want to think about in terms of the UI. One thing to note is that, when English copy is translated into different languages, the length of text may often vary. So, most of the time we try to provide a 25% to 30% buffer. But again, like it is a judgment call. So some things that you can do to help are obviously to provide character length guidance to your translators. And, if you're working in tight spaces, this is also something that you can work on with your engineer friends. Figure out different things that you can do. For example, making sure that your containers can adjust to the text size. Figuring out where you might be able to live with truncation if it doesn't affect the overall understanding of the text. Or you might think about things where, okay, if you know for a fact that text is going to be longer in a certain space, whether you could decrease the text size in certain situations or allow the text to wrap. So again, like things that you can play around with depending on what's right for that specific UI. Quick water break. Okay, so again, speaking of extra text, one thing to keep in mind as well is that we're talking earlier about how certain languages might not have the same specific words, and because of that, it's important to also have an allowance for additional text that might be useful to explain certain words that you might not be able to use. So if a word that you're using in English doesn't have an equivalent in a different language, you might need to provide additional space where someone might have to explain that concept instead. So I think like one interesting thing for me at least is, a lot of these rules are talking about how you might accommodate English as a source language to different languages. But living in Southeast Asia and this being the interface that we're all used to, this is actually a very common UI or interface in China. And I think, as a UX writer in this space, I have also had to, it is difficult to write in this UI, there's so little space. You're often trying to fit very little words, right under that chat head. So I think it's an interesting observation and possibly one way to think about, or empathize with some of the constraints that users and translators in other languages might face. Okay, so some very last additions to the translation things. One other thing that I find fascinating is how the same script, different scripts can often look different, with the same typography. So this, for example, is text which looks great in our go-to font in the app, but when used in Hindi, it does look very visually dense, and it is a bit difficult to read. So in some companies, when they do these translations, they automatically adjust the typography to the language that's being used. But for others, this is also something to take into consideration when you're selecting a font. Other things to think about, the fact that, when you're writing out dates, that they can vary in different countries. 11/12 might mean different things in different countries. Also, something else to consider is the fact that, if you're including metadata, so things where there's some kind of dynamic value in the text, this, might make it a bit difficult to translate because your translator has to take that text into account and modify whatever they're translating to be able to fit around this metadata. All right, so these are all, again, as with many other UX rules, these are sort of guidelines. They're not fixed rules, but 3 principles that I have found important. One, equip your translators with the right resources. Make sure they have style guides, things like that. Make your copy as easy as possible to translate. So simple, straightforward, always great. And of course, work with your designers, work with your engineers. Think about where you might need to adapt the layout just to accommodate different languages, not in different languages. One thing I like to do as well is make sure that once the languages are translated, that I'm also testing the app in different languages to see where the UI might break. All right. So I'm looking forward to questions about translations later. But moving on to the second part of today's talk. So what about localized English? So some background about me. I'm Malaysian. I moved to Singapore a couple of years ago. And I think, as is fairly common among many of us, I grew up, my family at least. Oh, I see there are probably other Malaysians in this group. Hello. So yeah, I think my parents, a lot of my dad's siblings were teachers. So at home, I had to speak very, very proper English. When I went to school, not all of my classmates spoke great English. So, I would have to vary how I spoke to a lot of them, depending on what their level of English was. And yeah, when I went to work, I was working at different startups where people were more comfortable with English. And that, of course, took a different flavor as well. And yeah, I hope most of you watched Shang-Chi when it came out. But one scene that resonated with me was this. I think it was a scene fairly early in the movie where Sean and the other female character were at breakfast, and they were speaking in English to, I can't remember the character's name now, but they were speaking to the grandmother in English, and the grandmother was speaking to them in Chinese. And they understood each other perfectly. I'm sure this is something that a lot of us in this region are very familiar with. But the reason I brought it up is that, looking at all these different experiences, these are all experiences where I was speaking English, but in very, very different ways, and with people who all had very, very different levels of English. Okay. So yes, those are my very, very cute grandparents. So yeah, I think the thing about that, I guess, is that this is fairly common in a lot of countries like Malaysia and Singapore and Nigeria and India, because these are colonized countries. And while we do have our mother tongues, a lot of our, our language of education, the language of commerce, the language that is, I guess, the language in which a lot of important things are done is English. So yeah, I wanted to include this slide as an example of, how English varies in a lot of different places. Again, it is English, but you can tell that, just like think again, in the next week, think about how you speak to different people. You'll see the kind of like, different flavors, either in terms of your grammar or in terms of what kind of words you incorporate into your English conversations. It's a very interesting thing to, notice. And this is a great example of how, in Malaysia, for example, this is a sentence that, I'm not sure what language you call this. This has English and Malay and, a few other different dialects as well. But for those of you who are, grew up in this region, it's something that makes complete sense. Okay, so why I talked about that, and now moving on to these three examples. So these are examples of three different apps that exist in Singapore. So the first app, I can't quite remember what app it was, but it is an app from a global company. The second app, of course, is Grab. Everyone knows Grab. And the third app is a very local app called Busly, which I just found out about recently, and I love this. So what I wanted to point out was the fact that, these are all three apps that exist in Singapore. They've all adopted a very different strategy around how they write or how they incorporate Singlish into their copy. So with the first one, that is completely Singlish free. It's a very standard way of talking. The second screen, I think you can see the little bit there where it says go where, which, some audiences, some users in different markets might not understand. And of course, the third one is just full on in your face Singlish. So the one thing I wanted to point out was, the fact that these are all three different brands. The first one, of course, is a very, it is a more international brand. I think that also sort of affects your flexibility with how much Singlish you can incorporate into your app. If as a local app, this comes off as, very cute. But for example, if a global brand, some brand that, isn't from Singapore, if they were to use Singlish in their copy, it might feel like they're co-opting this language, I know again that, it might feel a bit cringy that they're trying a bit too hard. But so this is another example from two brands in India. And I love the fact that, same thing, they've included Hindi and English in the same copy. It's all a little bit young and cute. And one thing I've really enjoyed seeing recently, at least, is this sort of embracing of this part of ourselves. I think just a few years ago, and again, it's this thing about how we feel about our identity. I think it's really nice that we started to embrace this side of ourselves, in our media and a lot of the interfaces we use. And I do see this evolution. I think it'll be interesting to see how it continues to evolve in the next few years. Okay, so we talked a little bit about how, language has a very local flavor, but I also wanted to talk about the fact that, language has a class dimension. So this is a chart from India, but I think it's also something that we can probably relate to in, here in Singapore as well. I think if you think about who speaks English really well and who doesn't, there obviously is a class dimension there. And our language literacy often directly correlates to our tech literacy as well. So this is a great example that, I think it's a product manager from one of the Indian payment apps. So this was a post about the fact that, some of these users, they might be using the app and they might not understand the copy that they're reading. They might not be familiar with the interface, or the different types of the different icons or iconography. But what they've done is memorize the flow. And so that's how they've learned how to use it. And of course, there are a lot of different reasons why someone might be using an app in English, even though that's not the language they're most comfortable with. We're talking about class earlier, and there's also a certain point of, it feels a bit aspirational. There is a sense in pride in using the app in this language as well. And of course, there are a lot of other reasons for this as well, which I'll go into a bit later. Okay, so talking about that sort of class dimension and how we think about this. So Indonesia is a great example where, in a lot of smaller towns, they actually have a lot of agents who help users on board. They help download the apps for users. They help them learn how to use the app. In some cases, they might have the app and users might come to them, and they will help them do whatever they need to do. So I think just thinking, it's an interesting thought to think about, in terms of how people try to navigate all these different things, these different language barriers that they have. This was also something that occurred to me fairly late. So I think, we've all been in an MRT where someone starts using their voice to send messages on their phone. And I used to feel very annoyed by that. But I realized fairly recently that, of course, some people, they find it convenient. And even in that case, I probably shouldn't be judging them. But I think there's also, there are also instances where voice helps make the experience more accessible. Watching some of my Chinese friends use their apps, I realized that they were actually, sometimes typing messages in Chinese, but in Romanized script, because trying to enter, characters in Chinese on your phone is not very easy. So, something to think about here is the fact that just because some people might be using the app in this language, because the input text may be a lot easier, even though what they're reading is not necessarily the easiest for them. Okay, so we talked a little bit about the local nuances. We talked a little bit about accessibility. One more thing I wanted to talk about is there's this kind of perception that in terms of copy and art, we are a little bit more delightful in this part of the world. So this is a very interesting chart. I think it's from the book, The Culture Map, which if you haven't read, you should. It's a great book about how our different cultures affect the way we interact at work. So I think if you look at this map, you'll see that countries like India and Philippines are in that sort of like emotionally expressive, avoids confrontation box. And you'll see other Asian countries like Korea and Japan in that bottom section where it says emotionally unexpressive. So these are, of course, a bit stereotypical, but I think it's interesting to think about how this then, is reflected in the kind of words or the kind of language or the kind of visual language that we use. So this is a very interesting example that I think came about maybe about 2 years ago when Marie Kondo was the hot thing. So I hope you can see the actual details of these screens, but the screen on the left is her YouTube channel in international markets, and the screen on the right is her YouTube channel in Japan. So you should definitely look this up so that you can actually see this in detail. But you'll notice that in the US, in Western markets, the layout is so clean, the colors are so muted, all the copy, all the video headers are written in a very standardized way, with that little divider in the center. And then if you look at the Japan version, there's text on all the screens. So I love this example because a few years ago, when I was at one of the startups I was at, we had to take on writing for, I think it was Hong Kong. And one of the difficulties we had with the local marketing team was the fact that they really, really, really wanted to put banners on all the images with copy. So like, with exclamation marks and all that sort of thing. And we pushed back because, as people who thought that we knew good design, this just didn't look good. It just didn't look clean. We tried to argue that, on a small screen, you can't actually even read this text. It just doesn't look good. And of course, we were wrong. That was not the right thing to do because this was the kind of content, this was the kind of layout that actually really, really resonated well in that market. And again, there's so many different reasons for that, which I'll show you in the next example, a couple of slides down. But yeah, I think one other thing I wanted to point out is the fact that, even though I'm talking about Eastern versus Western appreciation of different aesthetics, this, for example, is a very similar app where one is in the US and one is in India. And they look fairly similar, both in terms of color and expression and vibrancy. So I think, again, it is, of course, more true than not in a lot of apps. But I think, again, it's an evolution. And we're starting to see a lot more of this vibrancy in Western markets, and maybe a bit of an appreciation for this sort of like Muji-like aesthetic in some of our Asian apps as well. Right. So one last note. I think I talked a little bit earlier about the sort of Eastern Chinese app UI that we're all very familiar with in this part of the world. So this may look very familiar to you. These are all Chinese apps, but in Southeast Asia, a lot of our apps also have that grid design at the top where it's 8 or 16 or 6 chat hits at the top. And it's very interesting because this is a Chinese UI, but here in Southeast Asia, we write a lot of English copy into this UI. So Southeast Asia especially, I think, is a very interesting space because you'll see a lot of both Western and Eastern influences in the UI that we use. One other thing that I find very fascinating about this UI at least is also the fact that it's very discovery based. So, if you're looking at this home screen here, it's like everything is on the home screen. This is your point. This is your entry point for everything on the app. All your entry points on this screen. Whereas if you're looking at some of the more Western apps, I think Facebook is a very good example. There's a feed design, and a lot of the information is sort of collapsed, right? You have to go into a menu and then sort of navigate your way through different pages. So yeah, I think that's true of a lot of interfaces right now. But one thing I also wanted to point out is the fact that this is maybe the case because in these countries, a lot of the users were mobile first, and so this was sort of the UI they became accustomed to. This was something that was easily accessible. But in the West, for example, a lot of users did grow up using laptop interface or web interface. And so, they do have to orient themselves to that interface, which is why this newsfeed sort of thing makes sense because it is very similar to the web interface. And in Asia, for example, for markets at least where, a lot of us were mobile first, we don't necessarily have that limitation. We don't have to have that point of reference or that point that we need to orient ourselves to. Oh no, so this is not supposed to be a blank screen. This is supposed to be a GIF that is unfortunately not loading. Oh yes, okay. Can you all see it now? All right, okay. So this is a page from Shopback. And I think this is a great example of UI and copy that, for someone who grew up, I guess, with like this sort of like Western flavor of UX design, this might look a bit cluttered, but I think this is a very, very good example of how good, how you've accommodated copy into a Chinese sort of like interface. So some of the things I wanted to point out here was the fact that, there's a very clear hierarchical architecture here with the card designs. Everything is on this page, but you'll notice there's been a very clear decision to sort of like make sure that every segment stands out on its own. The fact that, there is very little white space, which is probably something that feels very important. But, for some audiences, so some audiences, this might always be as important. One of the things I wanted to bring out was, the fact that in China, for example, this might have been a starting point for a lot of apps because, historically, internet might not been as fast. And so having everything load at the same time, appear at the same time might have been important. The other thing I wanted to point out was the emphasis on a lot of the reward value and not a lot of copy about, specific benefits, which you might find in some of the Western apps. And I think with some Western apps, the fact that the reward value is called out so prominently might feel a bit too in your face. So I think, but it's something that we're very accustomed to and we're very, very comfortable with. The other thing I think as it's scrolling, you can see is the fact that a lot of the copy is also bulleted. So that's the section where they talk about how it works. And this is, I think, again, something that you'll also find very often in a lot of apps in this part of the world. Other things, the fact that the art is a bit more literal, and you'll see how it sort of works and complements the copy. The fact that the copy is a lot simpler. And so, I talked about the lack of copy around benefits here, but you'll notice that there are a lot of exclamation marks, which kind of, I guess, serve as the emotional tone here. And yeah, the last thing is the sort of de-emphasize legal text right at the bottom, because I guess in this part of the world, at least, it's not top of mind yet. So yeah, I think summary of this section at least is TLDR on what might be important to think about if you're thinking about writing in English for different markets. One, of course, depending on the kind of app you are, whether there's a need to localize or not localize. Think about language through an accessibility lens, because language levels are also, it is very similar to how we think about accessibility for different books. And of course, what's the right emotional tone for your market? Yes. Clippy, yes. All right, so that is all for today. And this should not say rewards messaging. It should say, ask me anything.
Thank you so much, Steph, for your presentation. I found it so interesting, especially your second part about how English, well, there's so many things to think about when using English in the region here. Nabil, do you want to flash the question on Slido? And before we head to that, actually introduce a little bit more about the design challenge.
Yeah, sure. So we have a bunch of questions on Slido, which I'm just going to paste the link again in the chat. So feel free to ask more there. And on Design Buddies, we're going to be having a design challenge, right? And what it's going to entail is design an app, a multilingual app landing page. So it can be in English and any language which you prefer. You can use Google Translate if you only speak English like me. So there'll be a grand total of 6 winners. 3 of them will get Figma shirts and 1 month of Discord Nitro, and the other 3 will get Figma shirts. So if you haven't joined Design Buddies, please do. We'll post the link again in the chat. Look out for the Friends of Figma Singapore Design Challenge channel and share your work in the channel. Make sure you link it to the social media post with a hashtag. Have you decided a hashtag yet? We'll let you know. We're gonna open the channel up to after the event, and what the judges will be looking for are readability, visual and information hierarchy, and effectiveness in terms of how it makes the current flow more usable. So if there's any more questions about the design challenge, you can feel free to reach out to us or post in the chat or on Design Buddies, and we'll walk you through everything else. And you will have about 1 week starting from after the event.
Cool. Thanks for sharing about the design competition.
No
Steph,
problem.
can you
Thank you.
unshare your screen and then Nabil can share the
Yes.
Slido? Yeah.
Okay. So I'm going to share my screen to show Slido, or I'm going to start. The most upvoted question is from Anonymous. How do you create copywriting style guide? Other things to include that it gets applied consistently across languages?
That's a good question. So some of the things that I think about, one, overarching principles. So I might think, for example, if I'm writing a style guide for a specific feature, I might think about 3 core tenets or 3 key messaging angles that I might want to talk about consistently in that feature. I might think about, just high level, how do I write for this? So in this example, I think some of the examples I showed earlier, it's very simple, very straightforward. And these again might be just sort of like general guidelines for how we write. I think about, a lot of the time we also document tone nuances for different parts of the app. So for example, your app on the whole might be written in a very warm, funny tone, but it might not be the most appropriate tone if you're writing error messaging, for example, where someone might not be in the right space to appreciate your humor. So things like that. I also think about terminology. I have, things like what are all the different types of words you might use in the app. One good example is if you've got a food pickup service, for example, are you going to use the word pickup? Are you going to use the word takeaway? And then, once you make that choice to then use it consistently everywhere. I might also think about different principles or like gaps that I want to make sure are noted down and that I'm always addressing in the copy. So for example, like so for example, I was talking earlier about how in some markets users might not have the same literacy levels. So that's something I would want to take note of to make sure that the copy is always written at a grade level that is appropriate for those users. So yeah, I think a lot of different things and also depends on what I'm actually writing about. Right, next question.
Sure, that was a really good answer, and I hope it cleared up any questions the original asker had. Often designers, this is instead of most updated one, often designers are reluctant to give more space to work with content. Main reason, 2 lines of copy looks ugly. How can we make them understand the importance?
I mean, I think at the end of the day, so I think it's not so much a conversation about how you convince your designer. I think, it's a wider conversation about how you actually convince folks that this is the right copy to put on the screen. So, there are so many different ways to validate. There's, of course, research. There's looking at support tickets, which can tell you that, a certain piece of information is missing on the page. So there are so many different ways that you can actually validate. And I think having that kind of data will help you back up your answers. In terms of, this just not looking great, I usually try to work with designers. And this is one of the reasons why I also love Figma, which is because me and the designer get to work directly together at the same time in the same Figma file and figure out what the right solution is. But I do work very closely with the designers on the team to figure out that, okay, maybe we might need to include more copy on this page, but maybe it doesn't need to be a longer subheader. Maybe it's text that's added on a different space on the screen. And that way, I think it's not so much about insisting that that copy be shown in a specific way, but about thinking together what's the best way to design so that we have all the information we need, but it also looks good.
Yeah, definitely. I also like what Catherine said about point having a great looking UI if no one understands what it means. Like, it has to be a balance, right? Next question is also from Anonymous. How do you manage UI copy at Google, such as version control, making sure the copy works with UI, etc.?
Okay. How do I manage UI copy at Google? A couple of different ways we do this. I think, some of us work directly in Figma and that's our source of truth. Some of us work in content matrices because, it might be copy that needs to be reviewed with different stakeholders where, going through Figma might not be the most accessible way to have those reviews. So we have different ways of doing this. And I think the most important thing for us is just having a source of truth, making sure that whoever needs to approve or review that content, like all that is documented whichever source of truth we're using.
Sounds great. And how do you ensure and voice in terms of nuance when writing for different markets, regions, even when localizing English?
Yeah. So actually, I just wanted to make a note on version control. If we could have version control in Figma, that would be really great. But how do you ensure brand voice in terms of nuance? Yeah, I think like same thing, so we have style guides for a lot of the English copy that we write. And these are resources that, you can share with your translators to make sure that they are writing, in the same tone or style of voice. And I think this again is a choice, right? So you could have an experience where every single market uses that same style and tone. You could, of course, make a choice to localize it in different markets, just like Marie Kondo. And again, I think it is a choice.
Yeah, the Marie Kondo example is really good. What do you find the most difficult when doing translations?
The most difficult, honestly, is trying to talk through character length constraints. Sometimes I think, you already have a design in place, and then the conversation that needs to happen at this point is basically with the constraints that we have with this specific character length, how can we make sure that the translated copy still makes sense, even though it might need to be drastically shortened? So with the translators, this is often the source of the most back and forth, just figuring out how to fit copy into the UI that we have.
And that kind of goes right into our next question. Does your team normally translate first, then adjust the UI, or work with more adaptable UI that fits for the translated languages?
Yeah, I mean, I think I know there's a growing market for bilingual UX writers who write source copy in both languages, and I think that way, they're able to write and test copy out in the same at the same time. Um, Sorry, could you just scroll back to the question again?
Sure. So does your team normally translate first, then adjust the UI, or work with
Yeah,
more adaptable UI that fits for translated languages?
yeah. I mean, I think again the question depends on whether you're only translating into one other language, whether you're translating into, like a small number of languages, or whether it's something that really just needs to be translated across multiple languages. I think in the first and the second instance, you might have a bit more control, because obviously, it is a small number of languages and you want to accommodate as much as possible. But when you have a wide spectrum of languages, what you want to make sure you're doing is that the UI just in general always accommodates any type of translation.
And I think this is a more of a fun question. How do you translate puns?
I have not had to yet, but I think knowing some writers who do have to do this, um, I think they give some guidance as to what they're trying to achieve with these puns, or any kind of like slang or colloquialism, and then that way the translator sort of gets the vibe, and they are also able to write something that translates well in a different language.
I think also I've heard, like, for example, some Korean puns do not translate to English very well. So things like that. What do you find the most difficult when doing translations?
I think this we covered this earlier, but yes, I think for me again, a lot of it is basically one. I think so. So just to add on to that, I think one was character length, And the second, of course, is like with very, very technical copy where I know for a fact that I had so much back and forth with so many different stakeholders to get the right English copy in place. I think it's also about making sure that all the nuances we try to get into the English copy are also reflected in that translated language, whether it might be legal nuances, whether it might be usability concerns, things like that.
Okay, so I know we're running a little out of time. Do you want us to do 1 or 2 more?
Sure.
Okay. What do you? I really like this one from Petty. What are you looking forward to the future of UX writing? With triple hearts emoji.
Oh, this is a really good question. I think two things. So one, I think in some places we are using sort of like machine learning to figure out the right words to use in certain places. Um, I don't know whether they use machine learning, but one thing I find very fascinating, I think if you log out of your Netflix account and you read the onboarding copy, that a lot of different people see very different things, different copy on that page. So I think just that, like in terms of how we use data to optimize copy, that's something that I find very interesting. The other thing is writing copy for non-text interfaces. So things like chatbots or voice UI. I think it's a growing space. I'm just very interested in how people are thinking about writing in these spaces as well.
How this the last one will be. What are your thoughts on? Oh, sorry, I'm in the wrong one. Sorry. How often do you approach user testing in different languages or dialects of English when you are not a native speaker or citizen?
That's a very good question. And I think so where I work right now, we have language managers who are experts in different languages. I often work very, very closely with them to make sure that we're able to get, the right script and the right words tested whenever we run these studies. But yeah, I mean, I think again, in different languages, I'm very aware of the fact that I'm not the best judge of copy choices or text choices in different languages, especially if I don't understand a language well. So always make sure that whatever language we're trying to test, in whatever language we're using, is something that's been looked at by someone who is an actual expert in that language. So they're both writing the right source content. We make sure that we're testing the right language, and that when we get insights, that there is someone who understands that language who's also helping us evaluate those insights.
Cool.
Thank you so much, Steph, for answering all these great questions from everyone here. And before we really go to the end of the session, I do want to remind everyone again that, as usual, we do have a job board. Let me quickly flash it on screen as well. So in the link that we shared earlier today with also the other game, there's a tab for job openings. There's a job opening open at Google. There's also a job opening at my company and a couple of more. So if you are looking for something new, challenging, do reach out to any of these people or companies here listed out. Yeah, hopefully we can help each other a bit more. And okay, so that's, I guess, like from Friends of Figma. Do you want to do the group photo, Nabil?
Sure. So if anybody wants to, you can put on your video camera. We'll take a group photo. I don't have access to the Instagram, but right now, but I can post this on Design Buddy's Instagram story, and feel free to do like a wave or something. You know what I'll do? I'll actually just make a recording on my phone, and what I'll do is I'll do like a countdown, right? So if you want to grab your like an object or something, if you want to dab or wave, do anything. If you see me with my phone, I'm just gonna record. I'll just be recording the screen, and I'm gonna change the view to gallery. Cool. Actually, I haven't done this before, so bear with me for a moment. All right, so whenever everyone is ready, I'm gonna start down a countdown from 3, 2, 1, and you guys can wave or do whatever. Right? So 3, 2, 1. Hey everyone, this is Friends of Feedback Singapore and Design Buddies, and we're here for UX writing for cross-cultural languages. And Stephanie gave a really nice talk, and we're really thankful for everyone who joined and came today. And this is the second page. So thank you all for coming.
Thanks, everyone.
So,
Thank you, everyone. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Chan, if you want to do the retrospective, we can just do a breakout room.
Yeah. Where is it?